When winter arrived in medieval Europe, it brought more than just cold winds and snowfall. For peasants living in the harsh rural corners of the kingdom, the cold was a predator, relentless and unforgiving. As the first frost crept across the land, peasants braced themselves for a battle with nature that would stretch their physical and mental endurance to the limits. The coldest nights of the year were more than uncomfortable. They were life-threatening. Picture it: a dark winter's night, the wind howling outside, the ground frozen solid, and inside, the air is damp and bitter. The fire in the hearth sputters weakly, unable to provide warmth for more than a few. The cold seeps through every crack, every gap in the walls of their humble mud and straw cottages. The peasants huddle together, wrapped in ragged blankets, their breath visible in the freezing air. The chill in their bones is a constant reminder of the battle they're fighting for survival. The unforgiving winter, the struggle for shelter. In the days before central heating and well-insulated homes, medieval peasants had to rely on their ingenuity to survive the winter. The homes they lived in were far from the warm, comfortable dwellings we are accustomed to today. Most peasants lived in simple one-room huts made of wattle and daub, wood and mud woven together and coated in straw. These houses offered little protection from the elements, and the roof often leaked, letting in cold drafts and snow during heavy storms. There were no thick curtains to block out the wind, no double-glazed windows to keep in the warmth. The walls of these homes were often made from the same materials as the roof, offering little insulation. The fire in the hearth, usually just a small pit in the center of the room, was the primary source of warmth. But that fire, no matter how diligently stoked, could never fully warm the room. It barely kept the cold at bay, and as the fire burned down to embers, the house would grow colder still. On these bitter nights, the temperature inside the hut could dip close to freezing. The peasants had no choice but to wrap themselves in layers of wool, sleep close to one another, and pray the fire would hold out. The idea of comfort was foreign to them. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Preparing for winter. The long work before the cold. As the first signs of frost began to appear on the ground, life didn't slow down for peasants. It only became more demanding. Winter was always coming, and in the weeks leading up to the coldest months, the villagers worked tirelessly to prepare. The harvests were brought in from the fields, and every available hand worked to preserve food for the long months ahead. There was no fresh produce in the winter months, and the food that would sustain the family had to be carefully prepared and stored. The work was grueling. Meat was salted and smoked to preserve it, while vegetables were pickled or dried. Grains were ground into flour for bread, which would quickly go stale but was still necessary for survival. The few months leading up to winter were a time of intense labor, as peasants knew that anything they could harvest or store in the fall might make the difference between life and death in the winter. While these preparations were essential for survival, they came with their own struggles. Harvests could fail, and bad weather could destroy entire crops. With no stores of food, peasants faced the very real possibility of starvation. And with the onset of winter, the land became an inhospitable place. Snow covered the fields, and the animals needed to be tended to, even though food for them was scarce. A deadly game of numbers. The cold is a silent killer. While the peasant families had prepared as best as they could, winter was not simply about managing food stores. It was about managing life and death. The cold could kill in an instant. The elderly, the very young, and those already weakened by hunger or illness were especially vulnerable. For many peasants, the cold was a constant companion during the winter months, gnawing at their strength and threatening their survival. Frostbite and hypothermia were very real dangers. A simple exposure to the cold could cause fingers and toes to freeze, eventually leading to amputation or death. The cold would stiffen the joints, making it harder to work, and it drained the energy of anyone who ventured outside for long periods of time. The peasants knew that they couldn't afford to stay still. They had to keep working, keep moving, or risk succumbing to the freeze. But the cold didn't just attack the body, it attacked the soul. The relentless chill left many peasants depressed, anxious, and fearful. The long nights, where the sun barely shone for weeks, seemed endless. The isolation, compounded by the blinding snowstorms, made the peasants feel as though the world had closed in around them. In the middle of winter, the village became a place of solitude, where the cold not only froze the land, but also the hearts of the people. The spirit of survival. A family united by cold. Yet despite the suffering, something remarkable kept these families going. In the face of the unforgiving cold, the peasants came together. They knew that survival meant more than just individual effort. It meant a community effort. Neighbors helped each other with firewood, shared what little food they had, and supported one another through the long, freezing nights. The bond between family members was strengthened in the harshest conditions. As each person struggled to stay warm, they huddled together in the small space, finding comfort in the presence of those they loved. These cold nights tested the limits of their endurance, but they also forged an unbreakable sense of unity. In the midst of the bitter cold, the warmth of their togetherness became the strongest defense against the elements. As the snow piled higher outside and the biting winds swept across the countryside, survival for medieval peasants wasn't just about having enough food. It was about staying warm during the longest, coldest nights. For them, the fight against the cold was a matter of life and death. The fire in the hearth, the clothes on their backs, and the warmth of their family were the only things standing between them and a bitter, freezing fate. The methods the peasants used to stay warm were nothing short of ingenious. They had no modern comforts, no insulated fabrics, and no thick winter coats. But what they did have was a deep connection to the land and a resourcefulness born from necessity. Their ingenuity and ability to make do with whatever was available became the keys to surviving the freezing winter nights. Winter clothing, layers that saved lives. One of the most vital ways peasants kept warm was by layering their clothing, a technique that might seem simple, but was crucial for survival in the coldest months. Wool was the fabric of choice, as it provided the best insulation against the cold. Wool retained heat even when wet, which was a blessing during the rainy and snowy periods that often preceded the freeze. Peasants wore several layers of clothing, starting with simple woolen tunics or shifts. Over these, they would wear cloaks or tunics made of coarser wool or animal pelts. Woolen hats and scarves wrapped around their heads and necks were essential, as most body heat is lost through the head. While these garments may have been rough and worn, they were critical in trapping heat close to the body. For peasants, keeping their extremities warm was just as important as covering the core. Thick woolen stockings, made by hand, were worn under heavy boots, and fur-lined gloves helped protect their hands from the freezing temperatures. These clothes weren't fancy, and they were often patched and worn, but they were built for function, not fashion. Peasants knew how to dress in layers, using the wool to create a barrier against the cold. But even this ingenious layering was not enough to fend off the harsh conditions entirely. The cold seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. The clothing served as the first line of defense, but survival on these bitter nights required more than just good wool. The heart of the home, the fire and its struggles. The hearth was the lifeblood of a peasant's winter survival. Without it, their homes would be nothing more than freezing stone huts, sheltering them from the wind, but offering no warmth. The fire was both a blessing and a curse. In the dead of winter, the hearth was essential to keeping the family alive, but it was also a constant struggle to maintain. In a typical peasant home, the fire was often just a small pit in the middle of the room. The hearth could be built into the wall, or it might simply be a stone ring in the center of the floor, with smoke rising through a crude chimney. Keeping the fire going required constant attention. The peasant women and men would tend to it throughout the night, adding logs of wood or, when wood was scarce, animal dung and peat. These materials were not ideal. Wood would burn quickly, while peat and dung produced a lot of smoke. But they were available and served the purpose of keeping the hearth alight. However, as anyone who has ever stoked a fire in the dead of winter can attest, keeping the warmth in the house was not as easy as it might sound. The fire would flicker, struggling to stay alive in the face of the cold and the damp. It could burn too hot for comfort, leaving the air stifling, or it could sputter out, plunging the room into freezing darkness. For peasants, the key was moderation, keeping just enough of the fire to maintain warmth without wasting precious fuel. The hearth was the heart of their homes, not just providing warmth, but also a source of light and cooking. The peasants gathered around it, using the heat for boiling stews, roasting meat, and drying the last bits of food they had. But when the fire failed, it meant an unbearably cold night, one that could be fatal. Sleeping close, sleeping warm, the art of nesting together. As crucial as the fire was, it couldn't always ward off the cold that permeated the very walls of their homes. When the fire burned low and the night air became icy, peasants turned to the most basic of survival strategies, sleeping close to one another. This was not the luxury of a comfortable bed, but the necessity of huddling together for warmth. Family members would squeeze together on a single straw mattress, wrapping themselves in blankets of wool or fur. But even the thickest blankets couldn't keep the cold at bay for long. The peasants made do by using hay or straw as insulation under the bedding. By layering this material, they created a cushion that trapped the warmth from their bodies and retained whatever heat the fire had provided. While this might seem like an uncomfortable solution, for the peasants, it was a survival tactic. Sleeping close together, even in cramped quarters, helped retain body heat. The idea was simple. Warmth was a shared commodity, and the more bodies that could fit under a blanket, the warmer the family would be. Furnaces and stoves, a glimpse of comfort for the wealthier. While most peasants had to rely on a simple hearth fire to stay warm, those living in more affluent villages or closer to towns sometimes had access to more advanced heating methods, albeit still rudimentary by modern standards. Wealthier peasants, those who owned their own small plots of land or who worked for local lords, might have access to an iron stove or a small furnace. These heating devices were a luxury for the common folk. Made of iron, they were often built into the walls and designed to burn wood or charcoal. The heat was more consistent, and these stoves could warm the room much more effectively than a small hearth. In some cases, these stoves were even used for cooking, making them doubly important. Still, even the wealthier peasants had to contend with the harsh realities of winter. Stoves and furnaces were rare, and most peasants had to make do with the fire in the hearth. But these advances in heating were a glimpse of comfort that some peasants could only dream of. The methods medieval peasants used to stay warm during the coldest nights of the year may seem primitive compared to our modern-day comforts, but they were born from necessity. Each layer of wool, each log added to the fire, and each body huddled together was a step towards survival. These small actions were the difference between life and death for families enduring the brutality of medieval winters. And as the wind howled outside and the fire flickered low, the peasants held on, holding close to one another, to their homes, and to the hope that the spring would one day come, thawing the land and bringing warmth back into their lives. As the wind howled and the snow piled higher, the struggle for warmth wasn't the only battle peasants faced during the coldest nights of the year. Beneath the biting cold, another insidious enemy crept into the lives of medieval peasants: hunger. With the arrival of winter, the fields lay dormant under thick blankets of snow, and fresh food became a distant memory. The preserved stores from autumn dwindled as the long freezing months stretched on, and hunger began to gnaw at the very core of every peasant family. Hunger in the winter wasn't simply about an empty stomach, it was a slow, insidious killer. The meager rations they had left could not provide the necessary sustenance to ward off the cold and maintain strength. As the peasants worked tirelessly to maintain their homes, feed their animals, and stay warm, the reality of their hunger became undeniable. Food shortages. The grim reality of winter rationing. The food that peasants had carefully preserved in the fall, root vegetables, salted meats, grains, was quickly consumed. As winter wore on, even the hardiest stores of food began to run out. The bread that had been baked earlier in the season became stale, and the meat, though salted or dried, lost its flavor and value. There was no luxury of fresh produce or milk. For most peasants, a meal during the winter months was a simple affair. Porridge made from leftover grains, boiled roots, and the occasional bit of salted pork was often all they could manage to eat. While these meals might have been sufficient to stave off starvation in the short term, they lacked the nutrients and energy needed to keep their bodies functioning during the freezing nights. The cold demanded much from the body, and without proper nourishment, even the most hardy peasant could become weak and ill. The hunger was relentless,